kind of represents an allegory as people who are trying to avoid death, but necessarily it's always there because we never know like when it is.
Nicely said. Great point. What do each of the following represent? Prince Prospero. The answer is someone who is very wise and arrogant, though. And it's interesting, isn't it, that this character has kind of these two sides, his wisdom to sequester himself and the people he cares for in his palace, but at the same time, this kind of arrogance. Can someone talk about his arrogance?
He always finds like a way to think that he held the ball or the masquerade party as a way to show that like he had the money to, so like he thinks as himself being so prosperous and like having the money, he thinks that as that way, or how like he has the money, so he thinks nothing bad will ever happen to himself because he can kind of find a way to pay himself out of it, probably.
Great point. Yeah, he feels like he's kind of invincible, doesn't he?
Yes.
Great. The colors of the 7 rooms. The answer is, I think it was the steps of how the disease began. People were happy overall a small amount of time. People, because gloomy and devastated like the black and red room. I think what that person is trying to say is that there's a progression of life seen in the progression of the rooms that culminates in the black and red room. Does that make sense? Can you guys hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, great.
We haven't heard from Chris yet. I'm worried his isn't coming through. Chris, are you there?
Chris, can you hear it? Okay.
There we go.
There we go. All right. The 7th room itself, what does it represent? The answer is, I think that this represented death and war. What do we think about that answer?
I think it doesn't necessarily represent war, but maybe just like the 7th room, how the story goes along to say that it had the clock in it, and it kind of represents that the time that they had left until the
Good point. The clock. That's a very interesting symbol, isn't it?
Yes.
Okay, the ebony clock. The answer is the time was ticking of how much time they had. And I think we just addressed that. The masked figure. It came like the night. No one knew it was the death because people were so careless. Yeah, and I think careless actually might be a very good word to use here because those people were so carefree. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. Number 3, how have the guests tried to avoid their fate? They tried leaving from the cities. Yes, that's true, I think. And number 4, what does Prospero neglect to realize? He neglects to realize that he is selfish, especially because he tries killing death itself. He did not realize he can hurt himself and others. So, what do we think about that answer?
I think that he, in a way, he is selfish, but when, like how it says that in the story, they described him as, I'm trying to look for the part where it said that he was happy and dauntless and sagacious, and it defines it as wise or like fearless. And I think he kind of shows going through when he goes to kill death itself, but then in a way he is selfish by trying to kill it, but then like it could spread more, or just like as a way when something spreads through death, like it's because like when the body, how like everything kind of just comes out. not realize, and I don't think he realizes it because if he caught it, if he didn't die himself, but he caught it, he would be spreading it to other people by having those masquerades or whatever. Like if he threw a ball or something.
Good point. Okay. Here are some more answers. A Masque of the Red Death is an allegory for life and death. I think we've already addressed that. Prince Prospero represents wealthy people. Yes, I think we've already addressed that. The masked ball represents there is no way to run from death. I think we've already addressed that. The colors of the 7 rooms each represent, maybe this person means an aspect of human life. The 7th room itself represents the time left until death. Yes, I think we agree with that. The ebony clock represents death or time left of life, and I think we all agree about that. The masked figure represents the red death, and yes, that's true. The guests have tried to avoid their fate by not accepting the fact of death. They deny that the matter of death follows them no matter where they are. That's nicely said. And Prospero neglected to realize what was going on around with people dying. That's a good point. So now we're going to move on to maybe a little bit more specific questioning. And the first question is, what is Masque of the Red Death an allegory for? Well, there's this thing called cosmic irony. It's one of 5 types of irony. Excuse me. And it's when a character tries to avoid his or her fate and does something that brings on his or her inevitable fate in trying to avoid it. This is certainly the case in a play called Oedipus Rex, which is said to be the greatest tragedy ever written. And let me tell you a little bit about Oedipus Rex, so you will understand cosmic irony. There's this guy named Oedipus, and he's a prince in a city-state in ancient Greece called Corinth. He's raised as a prince in that city, and there's a prophecy that says that he is going to kill his father. He believes this prophecy, and so when he's old enough, he leaves Corinth. And he leaves Corinth because he doesn't want to kill his father. So as he's walking along, he comes across this crossroads where 3 roads converge. And as he's walking there, what happens is a carriage with several men in it comes riding by him as he's walking, and they run him off the road, and one of the men in the carriage hits him in the head with a stick. So he loses his temper, he jumps into the carriage, pulls out his sword, and kills all but one of those men. Later on, he comes to realize that he wasn't born in Corinth, where he grew up, which means that his real father was not the father he thought was his father in Corinth. His real father, instead, was a man named Laius who lived in Thebes and was indeed one of those men that he killed in the carriage that day. So if he would have never left Corinth in trying to avoid his fate in killing who he thought was his father, he never would have killed his real father. So that's how cosmic irony works. We try to avoid our fate and we do something to bring it on. So in Oedipus's case, the prophecy comes true. And we see that kind of irony in Masque of the Red Death in the avoidance of the prince in trying to avoid the plague, and also in trying to avoid death by attempting to kill the masked figure. So in attempting to destroy death, he actually brings death on. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay. Now, what or who does Prince Prospero represent? That's the next question. There's this thing called nomenclature. It's a big word that means how a character is named. Some people say nomenclature. What about Prince Prospero's nomenclature, or the way that he is named, is interesting? What do you think about that?
I think it's interesting as a way to think like why he was like that, because there could have been other characters in the book that could have also had like the bravery enough or the selfishness to kill the Red Death, but I think it probably chose him, like, to actually name him that name.
Mm-hmm. What does the name Prospero sound like?
Prosperous.
Very good. That's right. That's right. And so he has this name that reminds us that he's prosperous, but at the same time, he brings death on himself. And that's kind of ironic, isn't it?
Yes.
Okay. What is the allegorical significance of the colors in the 7 rooms? Well, the first room is blue, and it's the eastmost room. Where does the sun rise?
The sun rises in the east.
That's right. The sun rises in the east. And when we think of the sun rising, what stage of life, if we equate the sun rising to human life, do we think of?
When they're being born.
That's right. There's a newness, there's a freshness. And the last room is black. And isn't it interesting that the last room is the westernmost room? Where does the sun set?
In the west.
That's right. And so if we were to equate the setting sun to one of the stages of life in human life, what would we equate it to?
Like the end of their life, or like death.
That's right. The sun sinks into the west and the day dies. And so there's a lot of symbolism in these rooms, in the colors of the rooms. So it moves from this very new, fresh blue color through the range of colors which represent the range of life, the range of stages of life, to ultimately this black room, which is the westernmost room. Great. Okay, the 7th room. What covers the walls in the 7th room?
In the 7th room, it was shrouded in black velvet tapestries that hung all over the ceiling and down the walls.
That's right.
Upon a carpet of the same material and hue.
That's right. Doesn't it kind of remind you of a funeral parlor or something?
Yes.
Okay, so what color are the windows in the 7th room?
They were like a scarlet color, a deep blood color.
That's right. It says a fire casts blood red lights on the windows. And so they are this scarlet color, this fiery color, or this bloody color. So, how populated is the seventh room as compared to the other rooms in the palace? It's not nearly as populated, right? And that's because it's so creepy. Okay. The ebony clock. What does the clock sound like when it strikes?
It said that it swung to and fro with a dull, heavy, monotonous clang, and when the minute hand made the circuit of the face, the hour was to be stricken. There came from the birds lungs of the clock a sound which was clear and loud and deep and exceedingly musical.
Excellent. So it's very loud. It's very loud and exceedingly musical. And that's interesting, isn't it? Coming from that frightening clock. Okay. At what time does the clock strike its last? Okay, so the clock strikes its last at about 12 a.m. exactly. Okay, why is the detail of the clock perfect for the seventh room?
The detail of the clock in the seventh room is perfect because of how the sun sets in the west. So the seventh room was in the west also. The clock kind of represented the time, like how we said before, the time that the people had left until the Red Death actually struck them.
That's excellent. You made a great comparison between the stage of life that we call death and the seventh room and the fact that the clock stopped. Excellent point. What does the clock as a symbol represent in the context of the story?
It represents how the clock started ticking as soon as they walked through the first room, which was where necessarily as in comparison to actual human life, it's the sunrise, and then as like it's continuing as they're continuing through the rooms, describing each one in it kind of it does represent the time left until death.
Great, nicely said. And so we could say perhaps that it represents human mortality, which is a big theme in this work. Why does Poe make the clock an ebony clock? What do we think about that? You guys know what ebony is?
No.
Okay, ebony is it's two things. One thing it is a very, very, very dark, basically black kind of wood that's from a tree. And they use ebony on guitar fretboards, and the wood basically looks black. And the other thing that ebony is a color, meaning black. So why is it appropriate that the clock is black?
It's appropriate because as it sits like in the seventh room, which they describe as being black, the clock represents death time left until like our sunset. So the clock fits perfectly inside like as the timer of until like death itself comes. With the
Great. Yeah, good point. All right. So next slide is the masked figure. What is it about the masked figure that angers Prince Prospero?
It says he demanded like who dares insult us with the blasphemous mockery, seize him and unmask him, that we may know whom we have to hang at sunrise from the battlements.
Great. That's some really good evidence from the book. I'd like to expand on that a little bit, or maybe generalize is the right term. Here are all these people in this palace, and they're all trying to avoid the reality of the Red Death. But the masked figure reminds them of their own mortality. So that's partially what angers Prince Prospero. He doesn't want to be reminded of the fact that this terrible thing called the Red Death exists. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. The next question is, what literally happens to the prince when he attempts to kill the masked figure?
He died. Isn't that the part in the book when he dies? Because he tries to attack him.
That's right. He takes a dagger out and he tries to kill the masked figure. And as he does that, he just drops dead.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so what allegorical meaning could be applied to this fact? How about something like, we can't kill death, death kills us?
Yeah.
Okay, moving on. What is the significance of the fates that the masked figure displays?
The mask.
What is? Go ahead.
The mask displays like a cold, pale, figure.
Mm-hmm. And when you say cold and pale, I think what you mean is that it looks like a corpse, right?
Yes.
Okay. And isn't it interesting that this foreshadows what the maskers at the ball, at the mask, will look like soon?
Mm-hmm.
All right. Now, how substantial or physical does the masked figure turn out to be? He basically turns out to be a phantom. He is insubstantial, and this reinforces the allegorical symbolism of the masked figure representing death, because death is insubstantial. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Last question on this page. What is significant about the fact that there would have been no way for a person to get into the palace once it was locked?
So it's talking about after the masked figure came in, or?
Yeah, I think what I'm trying to get at is how significant is the fact that the masked figure got into the palace?
It followed them in. It could have disguised itself as something else before it actually came and showed that it's corpse-like mask.
That's right. It followed them in. But it got entrance to the palace after the palace was locked and after no human being could have gotten access to the palace. So this is a kind of phantom. It's a kind of almost like an evil spirit or death itself that knows no bounds. It is able to get access to locked places. which increases the kind of frightfulness of the story. So the guests, how the guests tried to avoid their fates, and I think we've already covered that. They have gone into this palace and locked themselves in there, and with the prince. And so the question is, how does cosmic irony apply here? And I talked a little bit about that earlier. Let's see if we can give that a shot.
It kind of plays with cosmic irony in a way. It actually applies it to this because they think locking themselves in it actually helps avoid their fate of death eventually coming. But how, like, you explain that in a way, it's kind of like an evil spirit and has access to, like, locked rooms or anything like that. It actually just ends up happening anyway.
That's right. Them locking themselves in is doing something that actually brings the death on, partially because of Prince Prospero's actions in trying to destroy death. Very good. Okay, so what does Prince Prospero neglect to realize?
He neglects to realize that no matter how wealthy they can be, or no matter, like, if they lock themselves up, that death can still come in a way that they won't see it coming.
Good.
It doesn't have anything to do with that to protect you from eventually passing away.
Good. You know, it's also interesting that I don't think Prince Prospero knows that this figure is a phantom. I think he thinks that this figure is a human being, the Red Death I'm talking about. And so, I don't think he realizes that it's immoral to murder anyone. Notice how he tries to murder the Red Death. He thinks it's a person in that costume. And so, because of his immoral decision to murder that person, which is not really a person, but a kind of phantom or death itself, he drops dead because of his own murderous actions. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay, great. And so this kind of demonstrates something about the ruling class. The ruling class, in the case of Prince Prospero and people of his own type, believe that it's okay to murder others. And this is ultimately, ironically, what does him in. Okay, how are we doing on time? I think we're okay. We might come back to these questions. And so right now what I want to do is talk a little bit about Edgar Allan Poe, because I think if we understand something about Edgar Allan Poe's life, we'll be able to understand why he wrote this story a little better. Okay? Is that okay with everyone?
Yes.
All right. So Edgar Allan Poe, he always felt that he was different from others. He saw women as angelic figures. He loved his mother greatly. Poe's father abandoned his family when Edgar Allan Poe was only a year old. His mother was an actress and was struck down by tuberculosis. Have you guys heard of tuberculosis?
Yes, I know, kind of, like, I know you get, like, a really bad cough to go along with it, but I don't really know, like, where it comes from.
Tuberculosis is a disease that affects the person's lungs. And what happens in tuberculosis cases is that the people who are affected with it end up drowning in their own blood because their lungs bleed so much. And so People who have tuberculosis cough up great amounts of blood as they're dying. So it's a terrible disease, and it affected Edgar Allan Poe's life on almost every level. Another name for tuberculosis, I believe, is consumption. So if you ever come across the word consumption in your reading, it's tuberculosis. Okay, so young Edgar watched helplessly as his mother died of tuberculosis, and no doubt he watched her cough up lots of blood as she was dying. Edgar was only 3 years old when his mother died, and his mother was 24 years old. Now, the 3 Poe children were scattered around to foster homes because Dad had abandoned them and Mom died. And Edgar was taken in by the Allen family. Mr. Allen raised Edgar with good schooling, a good education, and fine manners. Mrs. Allen gave Edgar lots of affection. And when Edgar was 15, Poe, who was in great shape, swam 6 miles against the current in the James River. He was very athletic. And Poe was a very sensitive person. The woman he loved, his first love, died of brain cancer. And Poe found himself weeping at her grave very often. So he was very sensitive. Her death affected him greatly. Then Mrs. Allen, his foster mother, contracted tuberculosis. And while she was dying, her husband was unfaithful to her, and Edgar knew about this and disagreed. And then in 1827, John Allen sent Edgar to the university to get Edgar out of the way because he didn't like Edgar Allan Poe around. And at the university, Edgar's brilliance attracted attention. John Allen gave Poe just enough money to get to the university, but nothing for food. And this is the beginning of John Allen's kind of cruelty towards Poe. Poe tried gambling to make money, but he found himself $2,000 in debt. His foster father wanted to disown him, and Poe resorted to breaking the furniture in his apartment to burn for firewood to stay warm. Poe ran away and joined the army under an assumed name because he was afraid of going to debtor's prison. And debtor's prison is where they sent people who couldn't pay their debts. Charles Dickens talks a lot about debtor's prison in England in his novel called Hard Times. So Poe went to Boston, and he enlisted in the army as Edgar A. Perry. He even attended West Point for a time. By 20 years old, he published 2 books of poetry with his own money. In 1829, his foster mother died of tuberculosis. Mrs. Allen died of tuberculosis in 1829, and this affected him deeply. Now he had been orphaned by 2 mothers and rejected by 2 fathers. Okay. In 1831, he moved in with his Aunt Maria Clem in Baltimore. And Poe had a hard time selling The Telltale Heart because publishers thought it was too harsh. When John Allen died, he left lots of money to illegitimate children, but nothing to Edgar Allan Poe, which is pretty awful. In 1835, Poe became the editor of a newspaper. When Poe, as an editor, criticized literature, he was brutal. He had a very combative personality. He moved to Richmond. He began to drink heavily and crashed into a hard depression. Eventually, he married his first cousin, who was named Virginia. What do you guys think about that, marrying your first cousin?
Kind of weird.
Yeah. He was very devoted and he was a loving husband. Poe's life was a constant struggle to make enough money to survive. Now, here's the interesting part. The themes of Poe's stories are rooted in the harsh realities of his life. In his stories, he is obsessed with death. And we certainly see that in Masque of the Red Death. He created the detective story, perhaps, to attempt to find some kind of order in life because his life had been such disorder. Remember, his mother died of tuberculosis. His foster mother died of tuberculosis. He had been abandoned by his real father, and his stepfather disowned him. And so, the Masque of the Red Death perhaps strikes closer to Poe's life than any other of his stories. Remember that tuberculosis causes coughing up great quantities of blood. This, for Poe, became the Red Death. So the title, Masque of the Red Death, could say Masque of Tuberculosis. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So, like, in a way, he used his life stories to actually tell us for us to read later in time.
Absolutely. If it weren't for Poe's painful and awful life, he probably wouldn't have written this very dark literature. When Poe wrote Masque of the Red Death, he had already lost his mother, as we've said, his foster mother, and his brother to tuberculosis. And once again, tuberculosis in the story is referred to as the Red Death because of coughing up of so much blood. Over the years, Poe and Virginia grew closer and closer. And who's Virginia again?
His wife.
Right, who's also his what?
His first cousin.
That's right. They would walk together in the garden, and he would ask her to sing. And one night, as Virginia was singing, there was a slight cough, and then there was a drop of blood on her lips. And Poe suddenly realized that his love, Virginia, was going to die of tuberculosis also. So he had lost his mother to tuberculosis, his foster mother, whom he loved also, to tuberculosis, his brother to tuberculosis. He lost his first love to brain cancer, and now he's losing his wife to tuberculosis also. So would you say he's had a tough life?
Yes.
Yeah. So it took 5 years for her to die. And these were 5 years of pure hell for Poe. In 1845, The Raven was published. This happened in the midst of his private hell. When I say The Raven, do you guys know what I'm talking about?
Is it also another story that he wrote?
Yeah, it's a poem. And the refrain in this poem is, quote, "The raven nevermore." It's about how he's not going to see his love Lenore anymore because she's died. And so the raven tells him that he'll never see his love again. And so he earned $14 for The Raven, which is that poem he wrote. He was very poor. He only had one coat and one shirt for many years. And this is how poor he was. And can you imagine earning only $14 for a great work of literature that has survived all these years and is still lauded or appreciated as a great work of literature? So The Raven tells the story of a tragic character looking for his lost love. He is projecting forward the soon-to-be loss of his wife, Virginia. So when he writes The Raven, he's thinking about Virginia and how she's going to die. So just as Masque of the Red Death is taken from his real life in the sense that he's lost all of his loved ones to tuberculosis. The Raven is also taken from his real life in the sense that he knows his wife Virginia is going to be dying, and he writes this story, this poem about her, about losing her. So The Raven is a kind of rehearsal for his own bereavement. And during this time, Poe began to drink heavily. Now, Poe would never recover from the loss of Virginia. He would weep at her grave at all hours and cry himself to sleep. Poe also wrote another work about Virginia called Annabel Lee. And Poe's 40th and final year was a terrible struggle for him. He only lived till he was 40 years old, yet he was able to compile all this great literature. And Poe said that women had been angels of mercy to him, while men stood aloof and mocked. And the word aloof means apart from him, and mocked. So Poe was often sick or drunk or both. His once riveting lectures became laughable. The people who saw him last in the city of Richmond commented about how sick and pale he looked. He was found on a Baltimore street after 3 days of not knowing where he was, and he was only half conscious. Poe was rushed to the hospital, and he was delirious. A few days later, he died at the age of 40. So, let's just recap Poe's suffering. Who can recap, recapitulate, or restate why it was that Poe suffered so much in his mind?
In a way, it can relate to this day and age because a lot of people actually go through it. But as himself, like he went through so much from a young age. Like his dad left, like abandoned their family when he was. His mother died when he was 3 of tuberculosis, and then kind of just from there, each of the one that he's ever loved died of something tragic, whether it was tuberculosis or what was it, brain cancer?
Yes. Great. You're right. And nicely said. So, discuss the extent to which Poe's literature mirrors his own life.
The Masque of the Red Death was said to represent what he went through with his mother, like the Masque of the Red Death being tuberculosis, and then the Raven was about his wife, Virginia. So it just changed the names and changed the way they would have, like, the name of what caused the death or whatever, in a way to be published as writing.
Great. Nicely said. And so if Poe's life had been easy, do you think his literature would have been different?
Yeah.
Yeah, me too. Okay. So let's talk about the essay. we're going to be writing an essay on Masque of the Red Death. And Mrs. Campbell, just jump in anytime you want to talk about the essay, okay?
Let's see. I have muted myself. There I am. Okay.
Okay. So here's the prompt. Edgar Allan Poe wrote Masque of the Red Death as an allegory for the topic of avoidance. Begin your response by summarizing what you think is the story's allegorical meaning, the symbolic meaning behind the surface narrative. Then explain what you interpret are the consequences of avoidance according to the story. Be sure to cite at least 3 examples from Masque of the Red Death. So let's break the prompt down and let's talk about the first part of it. Edgar Allan Poe wrote Masque of the Red Death as an allegory for the topic of avoidance. I think we've talked about avoidance today, and we've talked about cosmic irony in the context of avoidance. Who would like to restate what the avoidance in the story really is?
The avoidance in the story is like people think that they can avoid that no matter like how wealthy they are, but it follows them no matter what, because they kind of just snuck into the mass grave.
Very, very good. I would like to add to that there is some cosmic irony, which of course is trying to avoid one's fate. In Prince Prospero, trying to kill the masker who looked like death. So in trying to kill death, he actually brings death on himself. In trying to avoid death, he actually brings death on himself. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay. So, begin your response by summarizing what you think is the story's allegorical meaning. Okay, so Mrs. Campbell, would you like to explain allegory?
Well, I was thinking as I was listening to your conversations, I don't know if any of you have seen the movie San Andreas. Did you guys have a chance to ever see that? Okay. So you know the guy who's usually in the Avengers there, he or the Fantastic Four, and he's the soon to be new husband of that the Rock's wife there. And he abandons the teenage daughter down under where their car has been trapped in the garage, and he runs off to go get help. And of course, he's not gone off to go get help. He just wants to survive himself. And you see him throughout the story, and he's just running away. He only cares about himself. In fact, at one point, there's a big force that comes down, and he's trying to hide from it. So he actually pulls somebody away, and he pushes them to the side and takes their spot, and that other person dies. And it struck me that's what Poe is talking about here. So an allegory to me is what an archetype. It's the same thing almost as an archetype. The archetype being that it's a specific moral judgment or some sort of story that helps us understand that we can do all we can to survive, but all the money in the world, all the importance in the world is not going to stop us from eventually having the same fate. If not the same fate, certainly a worse fate, because eventually, of course, he gets smashed by a huge that big old ship is coming through and dumps a bunch of stuff on him, and he gets squished. But that's to me what an allegory is. It's a lesson that we need to understand, that it has a moral to the story. It's a lesson to be learned. And so for this one, very much like what happened in San Andreas, is that we all will eventually come to meet our end, and there is nothing that we can do to prolong it, to prolong our lives, to avoid it. It just happens, and it's best for us. And I think too, the other part of this was, there are people who are arrogant enough to believe, well, that's not going to happen to me. And yet, one of the more dangerous things that anybody could have done was to gather together and try to isolate yourselves. There were people who tried to escape the bubonic plague, and that's exactly how it spread throughout Europe, is that people are saying, well, I'm getting out of here before it's too late. And they're actually taking the virus with them. And so that's, to me, what Poe is trying to get at, that we have to understand, we are not going to avoid death, that our fates are sealed no matter what.
In a way, too, as a Christian, like, we believe that God's coming back again for us, but some people who may not have the same beliefs as like Christians, or but like, we believe that God's coming back for us, but some people are turning to a more scientific reason of it. But no matter like what you believe, in the end, we're all still gonna like meet our end, or meet whoever we believe that we're going to. Like, if there's other gods that people are praying to, or if we're going to heaven, or if we're meeting like hell, or
right. And there's even is it a parable or is it a real story where the man with all the wealth, who kept building himself greater and greater storehouses, and he died and he was left with nothing. So that, even that allegory, although I think it is a parable in there. So if it is a parable and allegory are almost the same. So that very same philosophy is in the Bible as well.
Mm-hmm.
Great. Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about the essay. What does Prince Prospero try to avoid? I think we've answered that question. And what happens as a result? And I think we've discussed that at length throughout the Socratic seminar. So, since the prompt asks you to cite 3 examples from the story, and I'm speaking to my students now, I'm going to ask Mrs. Campbell to speak to her students in just a second concerning this point. But since the prompt asks you to cite 3 examples from the story, for my students, the essay should be at least 5 paragraphs in length, and I would like 1 citation from the story in each body paragraph. And so what I see is the introduction paragraph, then a body paragraph with a citation, another body paragraph with another citation, a third body paragraph with another citation, and a conclusion paragraph. And that would be a minimum for this essay for my students. And so, Mrs. Campbell, how do you feel about
that? I agree. And also, I think it would be easier too if you're able to kind of compare what's going on in the story with a story that you're more familiar with. So if you wanted to, for example, use the Bible's parable there as a comparison within it, that will make your paper even stronger. So yes, you want citations from it, but I think too that if you're able to kind of put it into perspective, this is a poem that has stood the test of time, or poem. This is a story that has stood the test of time, and that allegories are they're common throughout human history. So if you wanted to kind of compare that to something more modern, that would actually be really strong in your paper as well. But I do agree with the way Mr. Short has set this up.
Okay, great. And also, my students, if you would like to discuss what we discussed in the Socratic seminar today in your essay concerning post-life tuberculosis as the Red Death, feel free to include that.
Okay.
Okay, so it looks like it's 10 o'clock. Thank you all so much for joining the Socratic seminar. And students, if you would please inbox me through Canvas and with your name, of course, and let me know that you were here in the Socratic seminar so I can give you credit, because when I go to this page, it looks kind of crazy. It's hard for me to see who's there. Okay. All right. Well, thank you. Thank you all very much.
Thank you. All right. And this will be recorded and posted on each of our, where the Socratic seminar lesson is. I forget the number offhand, but these will be uploaded shortly.
Okay.
Okay.
Okay. Thank you, Mrs. Campbell.
All right. Bye-bye.
Okay.